Shalom and welcome back. Today I'd like to discuss two of the most misunderstood phrases in all of Paul's writings. They are under the law and works of the law. For centuries, many Christians have been taught that these phrases mean the same thing, that Paul was teaching that believers are no longer obligated to God's law, that the Torah was a burden, that grace replaced law, that faith replaced obedience. But what if that is not what Paul meant at all? What if Paul was addressing an entirely different controversy, a controversy that had nothing to do with abolishing the Torah and everything to do with the question of how does a Gentile become part of the people of God? To understand Paul correctly, we must first stop reading him through modern theological debates and start reading him as a first-century Pharisaical Jew speaking to a first-century audience. Because context changes everything. For example, Paul is not arguing whether or not God's law is good or bad. Paul answers that question in several places. For example, in Romans, he says, the law is holy and the commandment holy and just and good. If Paul believed the Torah was bad, that certainly would be a strange thing to say. Instead, throughout his letters, specifically beginning with Galatians, Paul is dealing with a specific crisis. You see, certain individuals were teaching Gentile believers that faith in Messiah was not good enough. They argued that Gentiles must undergo circumcision and formal conversion to Judaism, thus obtaining legal Jewish status in order to attain full covenant status. In other words, they were simply saying, faith in Messiah gets you started, conversion completes the process. Paul says, absolutely not. And that brings us to the first phrase, works of the law. Most Christians hear that phrase and assume Paul is talking about keeping commandments. But notice something. Whenever Paul discusses the issue throughout his letters, especially in Galatians, the conversation continually returns to circumcision. And that's an important observation. One where if lost sight of, will ultimately result in a misreading of Paul. So again, it's circumcision over and over again. Consider what Galatians chapter 5 says. If ye, that is you Gentiles, be circumcised, Messiah shall profit you nothing. Therefore, the issue is what circumcision represented in the Jewish world. You see, in the first century, as is the case today, circumcision functioned as the entry point into formal Jewish status for non-Jews. It was the conversion marker, the boundary marker, who is in, who is not. It functioned as a badge that identified someone as having become Jewish, that is, part of God's people. Therefore, when Paul speaks about works of the law, he is not attacking obedience to the Torah. He is attacking the idea that covenant membership can be obtained through conversion status. The controversy is not Torah versus grace. The controversy is conversion, that is, obtaining legal Jewish status versus faith. Paul's argument is simple. Gentiles become Abraham's children without undergoing circumcision. Why? Because they are the children of the promise. The promise given to Abraham that he would be a father of many nations. And that promise was actualized by the seed of the promise, Messiah. Therefore, conversion cannot be the basis of covenant inclusion. Rather, faith in the seed of the promise, that is, Messiah, is sufficient. That's Paul's argument. Hear him. Now, let's turn to the second phrase, under the law. Many Christians hear Paul saying, you are not under the law, and immediately conclude, Gentile Christians are no longer obligated to God's commandments. But let's ask some simple questions. Who received the Torah at Sinai? Was it Israel or the Gentile nations? Who entered into the Sinai covenant? Israel or the Gentile nations? Who accepted the covenant obligations along with the blessings and the curses? Israel or the Gentile nations? Of course it was Israel. So the phrase under the law cannot simply mean under obligation to obey God's holy and righteous standards. Why? Because for starters, Gentiles, as we just proved, were not given the Torah. Moreover, Paul himself continued to obey the commandments as well as the apostles. And yes, they did so even after the resurrection. So what does Paul mean? Let's take a look at Galatians again for some clues. And here we see the phrase is connected to the conversion controversy. Paul is addressing Gentiles who are being pressured to place themselves under Jewish covenant status, to come under the legal jurisdiction of Israel as proselytes, to become Jews in order to inherit the promises. And Paul emphatically says that is unnecessary. Why? Because Gentiles are the children of the Abrahamic promise. Because Messiah had already opened the door to the nations as the coming promised seed. The nations do not need to become Jews to be included in Israel's story. Consider Ephesians. Remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called the uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember, you Gentiles were at that time separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Messiah, you who were formerly far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. Therefore, we can conclude that Gentiles have been granted access and are included through the Messiah, not converting to Judaism and becoming Jews. This is why Paul says, if righteousness come by the law, that is performing circumcision and following the Torah as a proselyte, then Messiah died in vain. So again, Paul is not saying obedience to the Torah is bad. He is saying covenant status for Gentiles is not earned through conversion by way of circumcision of the flesh. Access to the family of God comes through placing one's trust in the Messiah, not through changing one's ethnic status. So Paul is defending the radical truth that Gentiles can remain Gentiles and still be fully included among the people of God. Not second-class citizens, not halfway members, not probationary participants, but fully included through Messiah. And this is exactly what was decided in Acts chapter 15. The Jerusalem Council never debated whether Gentiles could be incorporated in the family of God. They debated whether Gentiles needed conversion to obtain a standing in Israel. And the answer was no. The nations are welcome as those from the nations, not as Jews. And this is the heart of what Paul is arguing throughout his letters. It is not about abolishing the Torah. It is about abolishing barriers. It is not about rejecting God's commandments. It is about rejecting the idea that covenant membership for Gentiles depends on conversion and becoming Jewish. Again, Paul's gospel is remarkably simple. Gentiles do not need circumcision to inherit the promises. They inherit them through trusting in Messiah's merited favor. So when Paul speaks about works of the law, think of conversion status. Think of circumcision of the flesh. When Paul speaks about being under the law, think about Jewish covenant status, becoming a proselyte as a means of justification. But when Paul speaks about faith, think covenant inclusion through placing trust in the Messiah's merited favor. Now, with that in mind, suddenly Paul begins to make sense. Paul is no longer seen as fighting against the Torah. Paul is fighting for the inclusion of the nations. And that changes everything, because that was Paul's gospel message. Until next time, may the faithfulness of the Messiah and the Spirit of truth keep you until his kingdom comes. Shalom.